All right, welcome everyone. I have to say, in my wildest dreams, I couldn't have hoped for this kind of turnout, so I'm very, very excited to see all of you here. We're going to go ahead and get started, and then if you're just arriving, please feel free to go ahead and grab some refreshments and take a seat. I just want to thank you all for joining us for today's event, a panel discussion on corporate purpose, social equity, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Leslie Marshall, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Sustainable Business, which is in the Katz Graduate School of Business and College of Business Administration here at Pitt. I'm very pleased to say that the Center for Sustainable Business is co-hosting today's event alongside the Global Studies Center, which is in the University Center for International Studies. The topic of our conversation could not resonate more strongly with the missions of both the CSB and Global Studies. All of us have an important role to play in tackling the kinds of global challenges set forth by the SDGs, challenges like ending poverty and ensuring decent work and affordable and clean energy, realizing gender equality, sustainable cities and communities, and peaceful, just, and strong institutions. These goals are all global in scope and will require all stakeholders, individuals, corporations, governments, nonprofits, and educational institutions to participate and engage in a meaningful way. To that end, we've gathered together representatives from government, academia, and higher education administration to discuss the role that companies can and should play in helping us all to realize progress on these goals. In a moment, I'll introduce our panelists and our esteemed moderator, but first a few notes about the format and logistics for what you can expect for today's event. As I said, if you haven't already, please do help yourselves to refreshments in the back. We have Wi-Fi access available. You'll see the slide come around in a minute. You'll also see on that same slide hashtags for PittCSB, hashtag PittGSC, and we do encourage you to use those throughout the event. Feel free to take photos and post about your reactions to the event. We do encourage that. Today's discussion is also being live streamed and recorded. If you would like a copy of this discussion, please contact myself, or you'll be able to find it on the Center for Sustainable Business website at sustainablebusiness.pitt.edu. And so now I will we'll begin with about 45 minutes or so of questions from the moderator, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So we'll have 2 wireless microphones that we'll be carrying around for the second half of today. So if you do have any questions, we want to make this as collaborative a discussion as possible, so please hang on to those for the Q&A portion. And so now for panelist introductions. So first up, I will be introducing folks from nearest to farthest. We have Dr. Shareen Hertel. So part of our motivation for creating this event was the prospect of being able to include Professor Hertel, the Global Studies Center's inaugural Heinz Visiting Fellow and an Associate Professor of Political Science and Human Rights at the University of Connecticut. Drawing on 20 years of policy work with United Nations agencies, foundations, and non-governmental organizations in the United States, Latin America, and South Asia, her scholarship focuses on economic rights, social movements, and global supply chains. She's editor of the Journal of Human Rights, and her published work includes multiple books, most recently Tethered Fates, Companies, Communities, and Rights at Stake. We also hosted Professor Hertel for a book talk and lecture last night in the business school. She's also author of Activists Beyond Borders, Conflict and Change Among Transnational Activists, as well as Economic Rights, Conceptual Measurement and Policy Issues, and Human Rights in the United States Beyond Exceptionalism, along with many other articles and book chapters. She holds a doctorate in political science and master's degrees in political science and international affairs, all from Columbia University. She also has a bachelor's in international relations from the College of Worcester. To her left, we have Dr. B Bhattacharya. Professor Bhattacharya is the H.J. Zoffer Chair in Sustainability and Ethics at the Katz Graduate School of Business and Director of the Center for Sustainable Business. His research and teaching focus specifically on how companies can use intangible assets such as corporate identity, reputation, corporate social responsibility, and sustainability to strengthen stakeholder relationships and drive firm market value. His latest book is Small Actions, Big Difference, Leveraging Corporate Sustainability to Drive Business and Societal Value. He's also co-author of the book Leveraging Corporate Responsibility, the stakeholder route to maximizing business and social value, and co-editor of the book Global Challenges in Responsible Business. He's conducted research and consulted for many organizations, including AT&T, Bosch, Eli Lilly, General Mills, Green Mountain Coffee, Procter & Gamble, Timberland, and Unilever, among others. He received his PhD in marketing from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, his MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, and his bachelor's in economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi, India. And if we can just hop right over our moderator there in the center, we'll go to Grant Ervin. Mr. Ervin is the Chief Resilience Officer and Sustainability Manager for the City of Pittsburgh, serving under Pittsburgh's Mayor Bill Peduto. He's responsible for leadership, interdisciplinary team building, and management of resilience planning and integration within city operations and policies. He's the Principal Resilience and Sustainability Policy Advisor for executive leadership across City of Pittsburgh's departments, boards, authorities, and commissions, and provides program leadership and management for sustainability and resilience teams. Mr. Irvin helped lead Pittsburgh's participation in the first ever global network of city-based resilience practitioners established by the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilience Cities program. He's also been an integral part of the creation of many other sustainability-related initiatives in the region, including the Uptown Eco Innovation District, District Energy Pittsburgh, and the Pennsylvania Community Transportation Initiative. He currently serves on the board of directors for Eco Districts, as well as on the board of directors for the Pittsburgh-Allegheny County Thermal, a cooperative district heating system. He previously served on the board of Sustainable Pittsburgh and was chairman of the board for the Union Project, which I know will be familiar to many of you. Mr. Irvin holds a master's degree in public and international affairs from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at Pitt, and a bachelor's degree in political science and history from Washington and Jefferson College. And then to Grant's left, we have Dr. Aurora Sherrard. Dr. Sherrard is the Director of Sustainability in the Office of Sustainability at Pitt. In this role, she oversees the implementation of the Pitt Sustainability Plan, which contains 61 measurable goals that formalize our university-wide sustainability strategy. Dr. Sherrard and her colleagues work across the spectrum of sustainability, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions, incorporating sustainability into the curriculum, providing access and opportunity to all, transparently communicating progress, and embedding a culture of sustainability into the University of Pittsburgh so that it's a sustainability leader at all levels, from our campus to the international stage. She also serves as chair of the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Sustainability and is a member of the university's faculty-driven Sustainability Task Force. Prior to joining the university, Dr. Sherrard worked at Green Building Alliance for 11 years, ultimately serving as its executive director. She's also provided strategic and technical support to innumerable regional green building and sustainability projects, most notably Hazelwood Green, the David L. Lawrence Convention Center, and Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens. Dr. Sherrard holds a master's and PhD in civil and environmental engineering with an emphasis in green design from Carnegie Mellon University, as well as a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Tulane University. And finally, for our moderator, Dr. Michael Goodhart. Dr. Goodhart is serving as our moderator this afternoon. He's a professor of political science here at Pitt and holds secondary appointments in philosophy and in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. He's also director of the Global Studies Center. His current research focuses on questions to do with global injustice and responsibility for injustice, and in the ways in which political theorists think about these problems. His core intellectual interests are in the theory and practice of democracy and human rights in the context of globalization, and in related questions concerning global justice, democratic governance, and political responsibility at the transnational level. Professor Goodhart is author of Injustice, Political Theory for the Real World, Democracy as Human Rights, Freedom and Equality in the Age of Globalization, contributing editor of Human Rights, Politics and Practice, and contributing co-editor of Social Movements and World Systems Transformation, as well as Human Rights in the 21st Century, Continuity and Change since 9/11. He's co-president of the Association for Political Theory, an affiliate of the Human Rights Institute at the University of Connecticut, and a member of the Center for Ethics and Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. With that, I'll turn it over to Professor Goodhart.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks to all of our panelists and all of you in the audience for joining us today. Because we have such a large and diverse audience, I want to just take a moment to briefly talk about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, just to make sure that we're all on the same page as we begin this conversation. So the UN defines the SDGs as, quote, the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. The goals address the global challenges we face, including those related to poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace, and justice, end quote. And now I'll give you just a bit of history of the SDGs from the United Nations Development Program, which administers or oversees the implementation of the goals. The SDGs were born at the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. The objective was to produce a set of universal goals that meet urgent environmental, political, and economic challenges facing our world. The SDGs replaced the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, which started a global effort in 2000 to tackle the indignity of poverty. The MDGs established measurable, universally agreed objectives for tackling extreme poverty and hunger, preventing deadly diseases, and expanding primary education to all children, among other development priorities. The SDGs are a bold commitment to finish what we started and tackle some of the more pressing challenges facing the world today. All 17 goals interconnect, meaning success in one affects success for others. Dealing with the threat of climate change, for example, impacts how we manage our fragile natural resources. Achieving gender equality or better health helps to eradicate poverty, and fostering peace and inclusive societies will reduce inequalities and help economies prosper. In short, this is the greatest chance we have to improve life for future generations. Again, that's from the UNDP. So I just want to highlight 3 features of the SDGs going forward. First, the Sustainable Development Goals go far beyond sustainability in the environmental sense. They address, as I just noted, a whole range of related issues that are key to creating decent societies and promoting human dignity that will be both ecologically, but also socially and materially sustainable. Second, the SDGs are ambitious and require participation from all kinds of groups, including companies and corporate entities, which will be our focus today, as well as institutions of higher education and government leaders, as well as, of course, social movements and individuals. Finally, the SDGs are not just for so-called poor or underdeveloped countries. This is a major improvement that the SDGs represent over the MDGs. They represent global goals that apply to everyone, which makes them relevant to tackling poverty, injustice, ignorance, ill health, climate change, and other challenges right here in Pittsburgh, as well as across the world. So, with that brief bit of background behind us, we'll get on to a conversation with our panelists. And the plan is to engage them in a conversation about the role of corporations in helping to achieve the SDGs, especially those that have a social equity component. And this will be a genuine conversation. I'll post some questions. I'll leave some time for questions, and we'll get you all involved. I'll pose a question. I'll invite panelists to respond. You don't all need to respond to every question. You'll have plenty of chances to speak, so don't feel compelled to weigh in on everything. Then, once that conversation has taken its course, I'll follow up with the next question, or perhaps ask someone to elaborate on some point, or if something interesting has emerged in the conversation, ask a follow-up question or something else. We'll proceed this way for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then open up the conversation to everyone in the room, as Leslie described. So, without further ado, first question. What is the purpose of a corporation? For instance, do corporations exist to create profits for shareholders, to realize some social good, or for some other reason?
Is this like Jeopardy where you have to... Yeah, thank you. Thank you very, very much, Michael. And let me just reiterate that as the director of the Center for Sustainable Business, it is really, really wonderful to see so many of you having come to listen to this panel today. So what is the purpose of a corporation? So the purpose of a corporation is not to make money as the overwhelming objective, as you kind of put it. So The purpose of a corporation is really to work for the well-being of all the stakeholders it deals with, and that would be consumers, employees, suppliers, and yes, investors as well, but the investors are one of many, and the investors do not get a special place just because, it's a company, and a company's job is to maximize shareholder value. That is very, very much last century thinking, and this myth of a company having to maximize its shareholder value has been dispelled in the literature as well, and there is no evidence in corporate law to suggest that companies must maximize shareholder value. Indeed, the companies that have succeeded in the long run, they view profit as a consequence of the value they create for all stakeholders. So in other words, if you do well by your employees, if you do well by your customers and your suppliers and your community, then people will reward you. And one way that they will reward you is by buying your products, saying good things about you in the community, buying your stock, and so on and so forth. So to get to that purpose, so if you can believe that we must go beyond shareholder value to question a company's purpose, then what is the question that we are asking? And the question that we want to ask is, why do we do what we do? Why do we do what we do? That is different from who are we and where are we going, which are the two things, mission and vision, that we teach in the business schools. But purpose is kind of, so why am I making cars? Is it to sell as many cars as possible? Or is it to enable people to go from place A to place B in a safe and comfortable way? And that definition has a large bearing on sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals, because as soon as a company defines its purpose and answers that quite difficult question of why do we do what we do, it will see that the company exists in society and not the other way around. Right? The company is a part of society, and the company's job is to do good things by society, for the people and for the environment. And so defining the purpose in that way automatically opens the door to questioning what do we need to do now to be more sustainable. So without purpose, there is no sustainability. I'll stop there.
I mean, one of the things I would just add to that, just some interesting conversations that we've been a part of at the City of Pittsburgh. We partner with an organization right down the street called the Energy Innovation Center, which is a nonprofit organization that has been clustered together to effectively develop workforce development programs in the energy industry here in southwestern Pennsylvania. And one of the key things that we've been focused on there has been the conversation around the future of work, and understanding how we can transition as a society and as a workforce to address the needs of not just today, but also tomorrow. And a part of that conversation recently, we've had in folks from the Mars Corporation, which is one of the, if you like M&Ms, you've been a participant in the Mars Corporation. And they are an example of a company right now that's going, basically searching for this kind of answer to Professor Goodhart's question. And one of the things that they're asking is how much profit is too much profit, which effectively starts to create a whole sense of questions throughout their value chain with regards to workers and suppliers, and gets to this fundamental question of they're not just there to make profit, but they're there to find ways to benefit society. And I think this is part of the transition that we're starting to see in kind of corporate America or corporate structure across the globe, really, within finance and within private industry, that we're just at the precipice of, I think, in changing some of these mindsets.
So I just want to ask a quick follow-up there, because implicit in what both of you said is, here's the answer, corporations should be about this bigger thing, but both of your answers implied transition. So there was this idea of, in business schools today, we think, or the literature has shown, or we're beginning to see this transition. But my suspicion is if you grabbed somebody off Fifth Avenue and said, what's the purpose of a corporation? They'd say to make money. So how far have we come as far as this change in thinking goes? I mean, is this a view that you'd say is widely held among corporations in the world, or is this a view that's mainly held by people who are, sort of studying these questions intellectually? Like, how far have we come as far as this transformation goes from maybe a different mindset that existed previously to the one that you're outlining now?
I can jump in there in that my colleagues and I at University of Connecticut did consumer surveys, nationally representative. If you ever got a phone call and you're asked to do a survey, please do the survey. If it's researchers like me, but in 06, 08, and 09, 1,400 representatives, men and women across the country. We would weight the sample then to pick up the different characteristics of that type of sample, but looking really broadly at public opinion. And what we found when we asked whether people would be willing to pay more for sweatshop-free clothing and fair trade coffee was quite a significant willingness, well over 50 to 60% of the population. And if you cast your mind back to 06, 08, 09, those were not great times for American consumers. But the notion that putting your money where your mouth is really matters to you, especially as millennials, as a generation of people who think that the company receiving your revenues has some social obligation to do good in the world and not to harm the world that you're part of. The big gap for many consumers was where to find those products and how to trust the advertising or information they receive, the credence attribute of the product being trustworthy. And so I think we're in the midst of a very important transition, both in the purpose of companies and then in the manner in which we engage consumers. I am a professor of political science and frequently tell my students, you will make infinitely more consumer choices in your life than you will ever be able to vote. Every single one of us made a number of choices simply to get you into this room this morning. You put clothing on, you chose a mode of transportation, you're eating food right now and you ate it in the morning, you turned on light switches and off. So you're making choices constantly. And this self-reflectiveness, I think, is part of an increasingly different type of marketplace. You're also able to comment and share information increasingly in modes that you couldn't even 10 to 15 years ago when I started teaching. When I ask students how they comment about products, they immediately relate their opinions via social media, good, bad, or otherwise. And so I think we are in this really important inflection moment where we think differently about not only about the social purpose of a corporation, but about your role as consumers in influencing the purpose and the activities of corporations.
I love it that you took it to the consumer, Shareen, because I think that's a really important aspect of evaluating whether or not businesses are sustainable. So every business and organization is on their own sustainability journey. There are certainly the enlightened ones that CB and Grant were talking about that know what they're doing, that have embodied these environmental, social, and governance considerations into everything that they do and into their purpose and how they evaluate their success as businesses. But especially for businesses that are selling consumer products and that you see out in the marketplace, those are the ones that you see working most hard because they know that Generation Z, millennials, care about these things and they're actively marketing, as Shareen says, but that means they also know that you can see through that, right? And you're digging in to their reports, to their global reporting initiative information, to their climate disclosure protocol, and actually saying, are you actually doing everything that you're telling me to do? And not just on climate, also with your human rights considerations, also with your investments in your local communities, and what does that actually mean, and how do I see that? And so those are the ones that know what they're doing, and then there are a lot that are way back still at the starting block and are still looking at their shareholders and saying, oh, we should be making you money, when shareholders are now asking questions. Wait, is what you're doing risky for us? Right? Is actually the considerations that you're making as a corporation putting us as shareholders at risk, because those decisions actually don't have anything to do with money, but they do have to do with the environment. They do have to do with society. They have to do with equity. They have to do with our global footprint. And so those corporations are really the ones that I think Michael's question is getting at, is like, how do we move those into these different conversations? Many of those are not consumer facing. They're business to business. They may be in supply chains, and it may only be governments and universities and other, focused entities that are asking them the hard questions, and they're just now starting to look inside and trying to figure out what are they doing and what do they need to change.
Great. Well, that's a great segue to my next question for you, which is, and some of you have already started to answer it, but why should companies care about the impact that they have on social equity outcomes, and especially in the communities where they operate?
I'll go first, just because, so the other big event on campus today that's happening is the Community Engagement Forum, which is over in the William Pitt Union, and that is all about how the University of Pittsburgh interacts with our communities, right? And so we're not using the university as a proxy for a business. We're certainly not the only entity that does that interaction, and corporations have that same thing. So if you're a corporation and your employees are in the communities where you have a manufacturing facility, a large office tower where you're invested, you definitely want to make sure that you're giving back in that community, and you also want to make sure that you're giving back in your supply chain around the world. So they have to make that consideration as well.
Yeah, I think companies have to think about social equity because it's at a minimum, it's a risk mitigation strategy, which I think Aurora was saying a little while ago. So I've visited companies kind of, in the middle of nowhere, where they're working with the communities very, very hard, and the responses I would get is that, these are people who work for us. If we do not take care of them, then kind of who will? And if they don't show up to work, if there's high absenteeism, then we are the ones who are suffering. So we have to make sure that they have a good quality of life so that they can also create a talent pipeline to come and work, kind of in the factory. So there are multiple reasons why social equity is really, really important. And I've seen communities, for example, I was in Madagascar, working for this company, Rio Tinto, and they were taking good care of the communities, but it was not because necessarily that they wanted to, but it became a cost of doing business. It's a license to operate in such a community. Because when there's social unrest and there's strikes and workers prevent you from running your plant, the losses are far, far higher. So there could well be a higher reason for taking good care of them, like, oh, we are a good company, we want to be good citizens, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also this very pragmatic reason of kind of, ensuring that things run as smoothly for the company as possible.
One of the things I would add is maybe if you can picture the city of Pittsburgh as a 3,000 person mid-sized company with 305,000 customers, direct customers. That's effectively what we are. We provide services to residents. And one of the key things, and this goes back to what Aurora was saying a little bit, every company in their sustainability journey has to start with a baseline, has to understand kind of where their starting point is with regards to their sustainability journey. And when we talk about sustainability, we also have to understand that equity is one of the key pillars of sustainability. So when we started this kind of journey for us in the city of Pittsburgh under Mayor Peduto's administration, a key component of that was developing what we called a preliminary resilience assessment, to your point, CB, about kind of a risk evaluation. And what that preliminary resilience assessment does is effectively look at the shocks, the immediate potential negative impacts that a city can face, and the stressors, the slow-moving challenges that we recognize, but we endure. We understand they're there, but I'm going to get up next morning and I'm going to be able to kind of go about my life, although I know it is a challenge. And one of the things that we find in that is that in our company, the city of Pittsburgh, is that social inequality is one of the greatest stressors that we face. And that is both in terms of race and gender and in class. So it's kind of across the board in terms of those inequalities. And not only is that a risk for us, but it also shows that it is a big challenge when we're talking about how we are providing services to the people that mean the most to us, which is not just the residents of Pittsburgh, but these are our neighbors. These are the people that we live with each and every day. So how can we provide kind of the opportunity for everyone to be a participant in kind of the product and service that we offer as a city? And that's a key kind of measure, I think, for us in terms of how we're providing services, programs, making investments that you then have to integrate that into kind of the operations. And we've started to do many of those things, both from a budgetary standpoint, but also establishing key points of contact within our operations who are focused on gender inequality, our Office of Equity. The work that we're doing within our sustainability and resilience team is to be really at the forefront of these issues and integrating them into our service platform.
And I would just add that we've all hit on this, but there are pragmatic concerns on social and environmental sustainability for many companies, and then there are more enlightened or moral concerns. And so some of the most obvious and pragmatic, if you're in a highly competitive industry that's competing for workers, is decent training and treatment of those workers so that you don't have cyclical turnover, right? Another similar kind of pragmatic concern would be becoming more energy efficient, simply to have it redound to your bottom line. Those are very obvious benefits to the corporation of good behavior, both on the social and environmental side. If I abuse and mistreat my workers, I'll have a revolving door of people who leave or are injured or otherwise don't want to work for me. If I'm incredibly profligate and wasteful, I'll have very high bills. Those are pragmatic concerns, but then these larger reputational concerns that redound to who am I as a citizen of the place where I live and work, in the case of the City of Pittsburgh, or how am I fitting into the community if I'm a company like Rio Tinto doing work in Madagascar and need that social license to operate, or the government will tell me goodbye. Those larger concerns then become part of the corporation's manner of imagining itself in relationship to other people. And you all, as consumers and as citizens in the United States, have tremendous capacity to speak out and to be opinionated about the corporations that you do business with. And that reputational, intangible, but very important asset is part of the company building then the goodwill and trust vis-a-vis those people it interacts with.
And so just to hammer that home a little bit, you know, what we're all talking about here is values, right? And you don't often hear corporation and values in the same sentence, but sustainability and truly sustainable businesses know what their values are, have embedded those values throughout how they make organizational decisions, and show up in all conversations with those values front and center, right? And so, like, as these different organizations are on journeys, you see that happen in different corporations and organizations in different ways, and it's not always clean, and it's sometimes a little bit confusing, but we're all on that journey. And so by asking these questions, by choosing what you purchase, by, you know, actually like reading the reports, by voting your proxy, like, these are very important things that we can all do to, you know, change these conversations.
So as moderator, I guess my role is also to play devil's advocate a little bit. So I just want to follow up here and raise a question, because it seems to me like what you're all describing sounds great, and yet I see massive opposition to raising the minimum wage to a living wage. I see articles in the New York Times about companies that are focusing explicitly on producing products for the super rich, that they're only going to market to the super rich because there's a huge profit margin to be had by producing for those kinds. So how do we, again, I just want to, you know, for our audience, how do we make sense of the world that actually exists in relation to the world that you're describing in terms of these journeys of sustainability and the purpose-driven corporation and so on? Like, how do we, again, it's sort of a reiteration of my previous question, right? It's a little bit, there's maybe a little bit of cognitive dissonance between the sort of vision that you're describing and some of the behavior that we see actually out there in the world today.
So the movement is not as widespread as it should have been, and particularly in the United States, firms are behind in their thinking relative, for sure, to certain European countries and so on and so forth. But what is going on is that the Business Roundtable in the United States, which is a conglomeration of 181 companies, finally in August of 2019 came up with a statement where they clarified that the purpose of a company was not to maximize shareholder value, but to create an economy that works for all Americans. I mean, this is on the website. All of you can go check the Business Roundtable. Similarly, another kind of person in this cast of characters is Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, who's been writing these letters to CEOs every year talking about the importance of going beyond shareholder value to include all stakeholders in decision-making and so on. So it is a movement in infancy, and it is only by education, and this is why this is so important, and this is why I hope each of you make 10 other friends of yours watch this video or something else to this effect, to impress upon more and more people as to what the role of a corporation is in society. So right now, the opportunities, so it's a heterogeneous marketplace we live in, And there are tremendous opportunities to just make money and make money and make money, and and it is only through sheer hard work and teaching these lessons, I think, that when this generation who's sitting in front of us, when they get to the top leadership, hopefully we won't see those kinds of things anymore.
I'll go first. So sustainability is the balance of equity, environment, and economics so that current and future generations can thrive. That's not easy, right? And so every consideration that anybody in a corporation or an organization makes related to sustainability, they're constantly trying to balance that three-legged stool. And there are very few decisions that do that perfectly. And the SDGs are a great model for that, because nobody wants to pick gender equality over climate action, over decent economy, right? These are hard conversations and wicked challenges that we're all wrestling with. And so it's not always black or white, yes or no. There's a lot of gradient in between. And I think we all need to understand that these complexities are part of these decisions. That doesn't mean we can't stop asking the hard questions and pushing for what we really think is right. But it really means that we need to understand that sometimes what we're able to accomplish is what we were able to accomplish then. And then the next iteration, we're going to get it a lot better.
Yeah, I just added kind of three things. One is that I think that we are at the midst of a cultural shift in terms of kind of business culture and making the recognition that as both leaders and kind of employees within companies that we can make a difference. Just a quick example is how many folks in the room have shopped at a Giant Eagle grocery store? Raise them up high. So the majority of the room, if not the entire room. We recently worked with Giant Eagle last year, and I use this with my team as an example of the path of least resistance. How can we encourage to create opportunities of paths of least resistance? 4 meetings with key executives in Giant Eagle led to the plastic bag ban pilot in the Waterworks store. Now, is that their entire footprint? No. But it is one of the busiest stores in their footprint where they have removed plastic bags with the intentionality of removing plastics from their total operations. 4 meetings. And that is because the people within the corporation and the top leadership are starting in the midst of this cultural adjustment. The second piece is there's a generational shift that we're in the midst of. So CB mentions Larry Fink and kind of his infamous letter. That is transformational, I hate to use this in a business school, but trickle down kind of opportunities in terms of what that letter means to other investors. So this is the largest investor in the world basically saying that climate is an extreme risk, and if you are not accounting for it, we're going to account for it for you. And then the third piece, I think, is the issue around what can we do. The next 3 to 4 years, you are all, if you haven't already, we're going to enter into the workplace at some entry-level position. You're not going to be the chief executive, hate to break it to you, whenever you start day one. But ask yourself, what can you do in the positions that you have? And I think that's one of the fundamental things that we have to come across as corporate operators is how can each of us, as cogs in the machinery, make a contribution? And that's fundamental, I think, in terms of the cultural and generational shifts that we're in front of right now.
And I would just jump in because these are all really great examples, but the bag ban is an increasing movement, social movement nationally. In the state of Connecticut, in the town where the University of Connecticut is located, we just simply don't have bags any longer in any stores, and in many, many other parts of the state as well. And the state is actually not making the revenue it anticipated in charging for bags for those few people who want to buy them, because everybody's bought cloth bags, and at this point, the new normal in the state of Connecticut is you carry your cloth bags. We're hosting a student from Germany who said, how long did it take you to catch on to this? We've been doing this for years. So part of it is also just habituating ourselves to new ways of behaving, and those behaviors are quite catching. I can't tell you how many times I've almost hit people when I drive around the university area with their phone, their head in their phone. That wasn't a health hazard even 15 years ago. So we are quickly habituated to new ways of behaving, both on the good and the bad side. And what I think we're all encouraging you to do is think about this scale shift coincidentally intersecting with the moment where many, many of you are leaving into the workforce to be able to make decisions at the micro and macro level in your life and the patterns in which you choose to consume and you choose to engage. One final thought I would leave with you. I teach a lot of work, as does CB and others, on supply chains, and I really work with students to think about the clothes you wear. If I asked everybody in the room to just ask your neighbor where your clothes are made, and CB and I had a whiteboard, we could quickly sketch patterns of global trade very quickly because it would be relatively reflective of where global trade is. Bangladesh, China would be the number 1 or 2, a number of Central American countries. Very, very few pieces of clothing would be made in the USA. Where do your clothes go? How many pairs of jeans do you actually own? And what do you do with those things at the end? If we start to think about the choices we make in the sheer number of items we consume and where they end up in the waste stream, if individually we become simply more conscious, there are plenty of apps you can use for this, there are plenty of ways you can trace the chain, collectively we start to challenge what we consider in the current moment as normal behavior, which is to consume without limits, to consume with infinite range of choice, and to consume with no consequentialist notion of where things end up. If every single one of you multiplies this kind of consciousness to even 4 or 5 of the people with whom you work, it's like droplets of water on a rock. Suddenly you move a mountain. And I think it's really extraordinary when I begin to talk to students simply about knowing where your clothes came, knowing where they might end up. That alone shifts our notion of how many pairs of jeans do I really need, and where might those jeans end up at the end of the waste stream.
I think this is a perfect point to plug my book. Small actions on the part of many lead to a big difference. And this is the picture, my friend, that you want to tweet. I can see your camera flaring here. Come on, quick. So there are flyers up in the front and with me if you're interested. But seriously, we forget the power of the collective. We always think, who am I? I'm a very small thing. But hey, small multiplied by a lot is actually truly a lot, and we cannot forget that. So every little thing you do, each of us does, is absolutely key to us being a sustainable society.
Thanks. I want to bookmark for our conversation later on this question about social movements versus the aggregation of individual behavior, because I think it's an interesting one and one that we should definitely come back to. But to get on to a couple of the other scripted questions, I think we've already heard in the answers that our panelists have given some of the ways in which companies can positively or negatively impact social equity in their communities. So I want to jump ahead to the question about the SDGs in particular, since that's the pretext of our being here today, the SDGs, at least in part. So the question is, how do the SDGs provide a useful framework for thinking about social equity and sustainable business practices? Why should companies invest resources in addressing the kinds of issues that are identified by the Sustainable Development Goals?
One place that I would start is last fall, the City of Pittsburgh and the mayor under his leadership adopted the UN Sustainable Development Goals as kind of our one of the frameworks that we tend to. And part of the reason, just a little bit of context, was over the course of 2017, 2018, we had finalized the city's first resilience strategy, which is called 1PGH. And 1PGH effectively takes that preliminary resilience assessment that I mentioned and transitions it into a holistic strategy for the city to basically advance and thrive. And within that was concurrent with the time frame that the UN was developing the SDGs. And we started to look at these frameworks as basically ways in which we could start to create confluences of issues. And I think that's one of the greatest benefits of the SDGs, is it really encourages the creation of different, I just missed the slide here. I went and turned, I knew it was there. But basically the opportunity for us to work across silos and sectors. So a lot of our work is effectively thinking across departments, across sectors, so that it's not just the work that we're doing within the City of Pittsburgh, but the collaboration that we have, say, with the University of Pittsburgh, or with the nonprofit sector, or with the banking sector in Pittsburgh. Because collectively we are a community that can affect the change identified by the goals.
I think the SDGs resonate really strongly with people under 30. is one of the things that I found. Not that it doesn't resonate with people over the age of 30, but there's something about what the UN defines as youth, which I think that's a little old to be youth, but the UN defines that as like youth. There's something about this framework that essentially says, look, we don't have to choose and we can't choose, right? All of these things are important, right? Zero hunger, sustainable communities, zero food waste, and no poverty, right? These are all things that we care about. Actually, for Pitt students, good health and well-being is like a magnet of their favorite SDG because they see it show up at so many different scales and different ways. And so I think as a large institution, as a government, as a corporation, I think what I see happening in the industry is a lot of progress reports on like, here's how we're contributing to the SDGs. But I like the global scale and opportunity that they represent. It's sort of like mobilizing everybody, regardless of who they are and where they are, around these 17 key items and saying, look, it's going to take all of us doing everything we can on each of these to really get to these very large goals, right? And we have to do them all at once, right? This is the decade of action. And so these are tagged to 2030, so let's get moving.
And I think one of the things I say to people constantly is you get what you measure. Every single person in this room who went to college took the SAT, the ACT, or the TOEFL, right? There's nobody sitting in this room who didn't teach to the test to get here. We get what we measure. If we choose that collectively we're going to put really smart people like Aurora and Ervin in jobs where they actually measure to a set of coherent objectives, we will have far more energy than if just CB and I said, go out and be good and make money and have a job and be nice and help the planet. There's no focal point then. These are 17 goals. They're very ambitious, but you get what you measure. And if we have a collective endeavor organized around a particular set of objectives, and we share that information. They could go to Los Angeles and share metrics with Los Angeles because there's a major portal there for reporting. We share across cities. We share across institutions within government. We share between corporate and nonprofit entities. We're all going to move in a better direction if we have a common focal point. And those logics of organizing information and sharing information and transparency help move us all much more easily than if we did so individually, disparately. So they provide a common focal point. You know what it takes to get into college. You knew what kind of scores you had to put together. You knew what the ranges were for different places. Ditto with this. This is just a global report card that everyone is reporting into. They weren't invented overnight. As Michael said at the beginning, these grew out of several decades worth of work supported by popular organizations across the world, by professors and students and citizens groups, pushing their governments to take action in areas that they cared about. And we get what we measure, and this is a collective effort at creating a report card for the world. If we fall short and we benchmark against each other's progress, we create an energy not around naming and shaming, but around collectively working towards a better world for all of us.
Yeah, just one thing to add too, just maybe the corporate and government connection. I mean, one of the things that we've experienced recently, we put out a procurement for an energy advisor. This actually connects, we didn't know this at the time, but this connects CB and I. We put out a procurement for an energy advisor to help the city with our next electricity procurement. Exciting stuff. And one of the things that we were able to notice through the selection process was a certain company that was measuring their progress against the global goals. And that company is NL. And what we saw then was not just a company that had the technical chops to get the job done and the capacity to do the work that we need to do, but we also saw, to kind of go back to what Aurora was saying earlier, a value alignment. You know, so a company that is effectively aligning its values with the same values that we share at the City of Pittsburgh. So that made a very symbiotic corporate government relations in terms of that selection process. I think you're going to start to see more of that, particularly as both companies, small and large, start to make these connections in terms of up and down their supply chain.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because especially if you're a manufacturer, what you're looking for is that supply chain is your group of partners, right? And so when you have partners who you have shared values with, it is a lot easier for you to make collective decisions that benefit everybody, both corporately, individually, organizationally, globally, and you're already aligned, right? So you can do more, you can do it faster, you can do it better. And so finding those likely bedfellows is really important, and it helps everybody, do better.
So we've just heard a couple of themes emerge. One is the importance of the ways that the SDGs can connect the local to the global. One is the way in which the SDGs can promote a sort of integrative approach to things, thinking across different sectors, so we don't view these things either as, a la carte, well, we can focus on gender equity and not worry about poverty or whatever. And finally, the invocation of supply chains, which are, as I'm sure most of you know, inherently these days very transnational in scope. So all of that, and then Grant mentioned as well the sort of corporate government connection. So it's a nice segue to a question about the role of policymaking in encouraging the adoption of more sustainable business practices, especially with respect to social equity or people-centric outcomes. Should government policymaking play a role in encouraging these goals, and should those policies adopt an explicit SDG focus?
Yes.
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 Resoundingly.
Maybe one of the ways in which we're utilizing the SDGs, and this is kind of our first foray into drilling down into the SDGs, has been two what are going to be fundamental and seminal documents for the City of Pittsburgh's growth and development trajectory. And the first is our neighborhood planning guide. So this is effectively kind of the rules of the road with regards to neighborhood planning and engagement. We have integrated the SDGs into that guide. So as all 90 neighborhoods, I shouldn't commit to that, but as the neighborhoods in Pittsburgh go through a community planning process, this is the foundational backdrop to it. So you're not just thinking about life on land, but you're also thinking about zero poverty and clean energy as you go through that planning cycle. The second place that we're integrating it is within the city's comprehensive plan. The comprehensive land use plan is effectively the integration of our decision-making of how the 55 square miles of the city of Pittsburgh gets used. And with the SDGs as the foundation for that, it provides us this opportunity, again, for that type of systemic integration. So, a current transaction around land use and zoning, let's say, might not think much about gender equality, or it might not think about zero poverty when you're building a 15-story high-rise. With this as kind of the foundation, it does. So that is one of the things that we're trying to do from a policy realm to start to integrate things.
I would just add that it's the lens through which you see your city, your company, your country, your planet. And the beauty of the SDGs is that it is comparable at any level of analysis. Whichever level of analysis you choose, you can compare country A with country B in terms of progress. You can compare city A with city B, company A with company B. And I will just clarify or add to what Aurora was saying earlier about, because there are the 17 SDGs. Every entity, by entity I mean company, city, or country, everyone does not have to adopt every goal, because that kind of can take you out of your comfort zone and into areas where you do not have expertise. I believe that cities, countries, all the entities need to do what we call like a materiality analysis and find out kind of what are some of the key challenges that we have in this city. So we heard Grant saying poverty and gender inequality. And these are, there are 3 areas where Pittsburgh has come up with red lights, kind of, okay, these are areas of focus. Oceans did not come up as a priority. SDG 10 is taking care of our oceans, so one can excuse Pittsburgh for not kind of necessarily caring heavily about, but I imagine San Francisco or some other city that's coastal, in Florida, oceans are probably a big thing. Similarly, a heavy manufacturing company may care much more about carbon than a financial services company, who might care much more about financial inclusion kind of in the community and so on and so forth. So areas of focus are, I think, critical if we collectively want to kind of address the 17 rather than each of us trying to address all 17.
I agree somewhat, but you can't have blinders on, right? And so if people don't get asked questions that they should be asked, but that they're not used to answering, then we're not making forward progress, right? And so there can be a focus. So a really good example that Grant referenced earlier was the P4 performance measures that the City of Pittsburgh developed 3 or 4 years ago. And it was specifically for physical built environment projects, but asking developers about how they're helping City of Pittsburgh equity goals increase, how they're actually providing a place for local business to actually be, whether or not they're positively contributing to the equitable quality of life and distribution of wealth in a neighborhood by providing both construction jobs and like on-site long-term jobs. Those are questions that developers need to be asked, right? Because their decisions in the design and construction process and operations affect those outcomes. But if you just say, oh, we're just going to ask you the sustainable communities questions and move on from there, you're not getting far enough, right? So I would say yes, but you need to go out make sure you go out the right number of levels.
So maybe setting priorities can be a useful way, but also being mindful of the fact that the goals are in fact integrated at some level, and so you do need to think about the, yeah, great. I think we had one of the pre-circulated questions left about why US-based companies have been slower to adopt these goals. CB, I think, spoke to that 20 minutes ago in part in his answer. So I'll just put that out there in case any of the rest of you want to address it. But I think we should move, Shareen?
I'll do that really, really quickly, and then I want to move to questions if we could. U.S. companies have been somewhat slower than global companies in answering the call to action on the Sustainable Development Goals, in part because other countries have A, higher social tolerance for regulation, B, higher rates of unionization, and C, a more global optic. Many Americans haven't traveled outside the United States. They're not all that interested. Any person on the street I've ever asked in Mexico or India knows what their exchange rate and knows what it's trading against for the dollar. We have tended to kind of be Fortress America, Island America, and in current political climate, we certainly are. And so one of the things that the SDGs push us is to see ourselves as not only citizens of the United States, but citizens of a global commons that we share. And that's sometimes challenging for Americans. And yet I think we're in a wonderful position to think broadly about how the SDGs create a shared stake for us and other neighbors in the hemisphere or other neighbors in the in sub-regions of the world in thinking about our comparative advantage to achieving particular aspects of the goals. And so I would say American companies have historically pushed back against the idea of regulation or union density, whereas some European companies, many of them have had higher levels both of existing regulations and or unionization. And so there's a sort of intuition that I have that the goals can really help us get beyond what we view as business as usual or the climate for business as usual because of the urgency of achieving the goals. We cannot afford not to begin working in a comprehensive way on these goals at this point. The world will become increasingly, as we've seen with the coronavirus and elsewise, unstable, and supply chains are so incredibly global that at this point there's incredible interest both on the part of public-private entities in achieving these goals in order to make the world much, much more stable.
Just 3 quick kind of points. One is there's currently 4 U.S. cities, Pittsburgh, New York, Los Angeles, and Orlando, Florida, that have adopted the SDGs, in large part because of the absence of federal leadership. There is a growing movement across the city. You've seen this a lot in the climate side, but I think also in other goals where cities are stepping forward in the face of the lack of action from nation states. And that's partly because there is an inherent connection between cities or local governments and their residents. They can't ignore these issues. And as a result, we have to basically integrate them. And that's, for the good of it, is starting to create a lot of city-to-city partnerships. So we are part of a network with Brookings that is effectively facilitating these dialogues across 10 cities around the world around SDG adoption. Second point I just want to make is I had the privilege of being a part of a delegation a couple weeks ago of 10 U.S. cities that were in a waste and energy exchange in Sweden. And we went to 2 cities, Helsingborg, Sweden, and Stockholm. And one of the things that blew me away was, and this is, it might sound exciting, but we were in wastewater treatment plants, energy plants, and a couple other technical facilities, which were really cool. But in every one of them, a tech conference, a wastewater treatment plant, and an energy plant, they all had the global goals on the wall as part of presentations integrated in their operations.
You've all been a great audience to this point. I'm sure you have lots of questions. So rather than me continue to pose questions to our panelists, let me open it up to you. And we've got a couple of microphones in the audience. So if you have a question, please just put up your hand and we'll get to you as soon as we can. Start here and then here and here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Miranda. I'm a consultant with 3R Sustainability right down the street. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and thoughts. My question stems more from the supply chain side, and it is, how do you work with and acknowledge cultural differences when it comes to discussing and engaging with sustainability in the SDGs? I have an example to go with this. It's not the best, so bear with me. Child labor, for example, is a horrible practice, and a lot of organizations have made attempts to eliminate it through the UN Global Compact Principles, Supplier Code of Conduct. So then how do you go to your factories overseas that have those children working in those factories because those families need an additional source of income to buy food, pay for just basic necessities? How do you explain to them that it's better that their children are in school as opposed to getting a direct financial, I know I'm looking to you, Dr. Hertel, that it's better for the long run, and it's not just a westernized philosophy being pushed on them that this is the best thing to do and we're telling you to do it, but it's better for the long run.
Sure.
As it happens, one of our panelists wrote a book on this question.
So I think the book that Michael's referring to is a 2006 book, and Leslie kindly mentioned it, Unexpected Power, Conflict, and Change among Transnational Activists. And this looked specifically at the case in the early 1990s of child labor in Bangladesh. What I need to start with by saying to you all is the oldest UN agency is the International Labor Organization. It's founded in 1919, and there are over 200 different labor laws that exist that are part of the ILO's framework, and the United States has ratified many of those, and countries around the world have. And there are many different frameworks, but that children can work legally under ILO 138 as young as 12 in many countries in the rest of the world, legally. And the goal is a world with no child labor, but we know that in less hazardous forms of work, many children as young as 12 can work and combine work with school. In fact, when you have to pay for your books and uniform, as you do in many developing countries, this is the only way you can go to school. Creating flexible schools where children can go to school at night is a very popular option. Corporations investing directly in ongoing education for younger workers is also an option. But also distinguishing between the worst forms of child labor. So ILO Convention 189 says there are 4 forms of hazardous child work that no one, no matter how poor, should have to do. One is hazardous work that will kill you. The second is sexual exploitation. The third is forced child labor, which means you're a slave. And the fourth is the use of children in illicit work as a drug mule, as a drug runner. Nobody, no matter how poor, wants their child to do those 4 forms of child work. So distinguishing between light work that can be combined with school and the worst forms of child labor, developing countries themselves, Bangladesh, India, and others, were among the first to ratify the distinct convention that outlines the distinguishing features of those 2 different types of work. So in my conversations with manufacturers, they will often say, no, we would rather hire adults. Yes, we would love to price the product at a value where we can pay the parents enough to work, but American consumers tell us they won't pay that much for those jeans. I would say to you, American consumers, getting rid of child labor is in part being willing to buy fewer pairs at a higher price. So child labor doesn't go away simply because we want to kick children out the back door. It goes away when we equally invest in development assistance and fair trade rules for the countries where those children work. So it's a really complex, multi-layered problem. but it's one where there's plenty of international law. There are amazing non-governmental organizations, if you want to support Save the Children and others. They do tremendous work at the community level. And most codes of conduct for corporations now explicitly recognize the prohibition on forced child labor, and U.S. trade law, the hot goods provision under U.S. trade law, which has existed since the mid-1990s, allows for the seizure on port of entry of any product made with forcible child labor. And so for manufacturers, there's no interest in having a truckload of goods seized at the border and sent back because there's evidence of forcible child labor. We have those provisions on the books because American consumers said this was important. I would push American consumers both to look at wage equity and to look at development assistance because child labor results from poverty. And simply changing laws is not enough. We have to also be willing to support development in the places that child labor stems from.
I think one of the worst things a company can do is actually to go into these other countries where production is happening and talk to them without really understanding the cultural context of the country and of the children and what they're going through. And this naivety does exist amongst a swath of multinationals. I mean, kind of, so it's black or white. I mean, oh, child labor is bad, so we shouldn't have any child labor. Well, I mean, what are the children going to do? Are you investing in schools? Are you doing something, you know, are you paying their parents a wage that they can send the child to school? So I would urge, just speaking from the company side, I really want to urge companies to accept the complexity of the situation, to invest time in kind of understanding the cultural context in which they are kind of going to say yay, nay, or something in between. I mean, there are many, many, many shades of gray, as Shareen just pointed out, kind of, you know, there are several options. So to understand that the landscape, to understand the complexity of the landscape is absolutely key.
Thank you for this panel and great discussion. I'm attending the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs.
Is it on?
I have two questions. How can the balance of sustainability between equity, environment, and education, and in the best interest of the economy, how do companies, corporations manage that balance?
I mean, one thing that we're starting to see is, I think we talked a little bit about reporting, and the aspect of creating transparency. First, as a company or a corporate entity investigating what your materiality or what is kind of your connection to the global goals. I mentioned the voluntary local review that we're establishing right now, which New York City has been the first to do that. But we also have a series of other kind of accountability measures, whether it's the Carbon Disclosure Project, or in our case, we also report to what's called the American Council for Energy Efficient Economies. So these are effectively baselining tools that basically show what we are doing. I could argue how well they actually account for that, but that's a whole other story. But it also creates kind of an internal to-do list in terms of what are some of the things that you as a corporate entity can do to improve. The other thing is it offers a sense of transparency and accountability, as well as cooperation opportunities across sectors. So one of the things, for example, with CDP that we have done is started to introduce ourselves to other governments who are reporting to Carbon Disclosure Project, but also other corporate entities. So that starts to create kind of a networking opportunity, which has effectively been a valuable learning exercise for us.
So over the past 20 years, you may have noticed by this panel, sustainability has become a profession, right? So you have sustainability directors and managers and teams in corporations, universities, governments who are wrestling with that balance every day with every decision. And like you've heard most of us say, you know, there's lots of gray area, and we're just making the best decisions that we can with the information that we have at the time to make that decision, while having both a short and a long-term view and taking multiple stakeholders' considerations and multiple disciplines into consideration, right? These are complicated things. As the child labor answer, you know, indicates, like, there's not an easy answer in a lot of these like conversations, right? And you sort of wrestle with every decision, contract, purchase, supply chain, relationship, and get there. And so, I mean, this doesn't necessarily answer your question, but like people are wrestling with all of this every day and doing their best. Like if you want to be part of that, like get in there. You don't have to have sustainability in your title. You don't have to be, on a sustainability team. But if you're working for a company or an organization that shares your values, the door will be open for you to have and shape those conversations and decisions.
Hi, my name's Amber Thompson. I am a consultant with Leaders of Change. We practice organization development with an equity lens, and think about what CB said regarding lenses and how you are all saying it's hard to figure out which one to focus on, how to focus, and especially thinking about accountability. Where is in your work or in this panel or in CATS is diversity and inclusion being represented? D&I is failing miserably globally, not just the United States. And I think what sustainability does is kind of erasure with racial justice. And we need people to do everything you're saying. So there is a way to prioritize. There's also a way to hold these people accountable. And there's also a way to include all these people. We can't talk internationally and continue to have white folks speaking about how everything needs to be done. So how are you guys doing that? Where is it being done? And especially the accountability measure. Thank you.
I think Aurora can
You want me to go
speak
first?
to it.
And then Aurora and
I'll talk about universities in general. And then Shareen can. So in universities nationally, what you generally see is diversity and inclusion in a separate office from sustainability. And you've got that here at Pitt, right? But these conversations are connected, and there are a lot of people at a lot of universities who are trying to connect these conversations, right? And so I want to say the way that the language has evolved within universities is it's not just D&I, it's DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I actually met a university last week who they actually combined their equity and sustainability office into one and named it as such, and they left their diversity, actually they combined equity and inclusion into one. They left their diversity office more as a compliance office, which was incredibly intriguing and interesting. But I think the takeaway is these are hard cultural conversations within organizations, and there are people within all scales of and types of organizations who are trying to mash these conversations up and together and make sure that they're being held in the best way possible, right? And I'll also say, since she's sitting in the front row at Pitt, Jennifer Barnes is our diversity and sustainability supplier manager. And so, at least within purchasing at Pitt, we have combined those conversations with how we evaluate our vendors and suppliers. And that's a very interesting juxtaposition.
And I would say that, and both Michael and I could probably speak to this, but our work as scholars directly looks at social movements and social mobilizations as drivers of changes in human rights. So we didn't get ILO 182 because a bunch of white people in New York decided it was important to distinguish the worst forms of child labor. We got that convention because people in South Asia said, wait a minute, hold the phone. You are not listening to what is happening at the grassroots level in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and elsewhere. And guess what? The poverty that drives these children is your obligation just as much as managing your supply chain transparently is. And those kinds of claim making are echoing in the US around water quality in Flint and Detroit, which is changing the nature of how the human rights movement has to see the right to water in the United States. So when the rapporteur on water for the UN goes to Flint and holds the government accountable, that, for us as human rights scholars, is how the change has to happen around diversity and inclusion. It can't happen from the top down. It has to happen by creating frameworks where people are participating in co-constructing what they mean by the right to water. So it's a very interesting moment where, within the human rights frame, I would argue, and probably Michael as well, that we are at a moment where you're saying these international norms give people access to conversations, and we have to actually contest what the norms mean by including a wider range of people in defining what we mean, for example, by right to water, or other issues. So those kinds of conversations are happening simultaneously with this conversation around the goals. And for me, what that does is it says that that local knowledge, that local engagement, and that imperative for equity has to be part of achieving the goals in a real and robust way. And I would say that the goals are all window dressing if equity isn't central to them. And this is why, as Aurora is saying, people are fundamentally having to rethink the silos that have existed for a long period of time that are compliance-focused as opposed to transformational.
Can I pick up on that? I want to hit it on kind of two levels. One is, I mentioned how inequality was one of the fundamental stressors that we recognized coming out of our resilience strategy. And one of the first steps for that was to create, we partnered with a 5-city cohort to create the Pittsburgh Equity Indicators Project, which was effectively the first baseline that the city has ever done with regards to inequality across the city. And that was fundamental, I think, for one reason was we as the city did it. It wasn't a university, it wasn't a research team, it was basically us turning the lens and looking at ourselves. What that also translated into was following up with that was the creation of a gender equity report that created kind of, I would say, the next generation analysis would put both racial inequality and gender inequality and to basically show where those glaring marks are. What that basically then serves for us as a policy tool. How do you start to then readjust public policy, make both strategic investments, but also to this organizational structure question, how do you create alignment? That alignment between our Office of Sustainability and Resilience and then our Office of Equity basically led to our adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals because of that confluence. That's at kind of the macro level. One of the things that has probably been most transformative, though, our Office of Equity developed a program with a group called GARE, which basically took, there was probably about 10 departments in the first education training, where we looked at city processes and asked ourselves the questions, where do the inequalities exist? And, you know, the one that always sticks out for me, as a planning department, we are able to identify notification as being a systemic inequality. So anytime if you get a notice from, for a public meeting in the city of Pittsburgh, it goes to homeowners. It doesn't go to residents. And this is like that type of light bulb that all of a sudden 40 to 50% of the population, because they're renters, isn't getting the notice for a public meeting. So how do you then start to eliminate that barrier in order to create greater community participation? Those are some of the, I think, when you get down to the tangible things that you can start to deliver.
Yeah, I'm just, sorry, we just have one more question and we're out of So yeah, and I think, I mean, maybe this summarizes something that Aurora and Shareen both said. I mean, Shareen and I have been working on human rights for decades, and people often ask the question about cultural imperialism or insensitivity or Western imperialism associated with human rights, and there's this debate back and forth and whatever. Human rights are a tool. The SDGs are a tool. They can be used to shut down conversations and exclude people. They can be used to open up conversations and include people. How that happens is a function of the work that social movements do primarily, as well as the work that universities and corporations do, right? We hope that the university, I think the panel is illustration of this, tries to take on some of this work increasingly if we push it from the inside. It's not always willing to, right? It doesn't always step up and want to, but it's getting better, right? Because people are pushing. So it's going to be the same thing, right? I mean, you're absolutely right that none of these things is a guarantee, and none of these things works if a bunch of people make those decisions and try to have them percolate down. But that's not to say they can't potentially be used effectively, and I think it's on all of us to make sure that they are. This gentleman has been waiting patiently. Just before we turn to you, because I know it's almost 2 o'clock and lots of people have already had to leave, I just want to thank everyone for being here. It's a great the panel is a great illustration, I think, of the kind of work that the Center for Sustainable Business, which is just off to a great start since its launch in October, and that we, from a different angle at the Global Studies Center, try to do, thinking about these kinds of important transnational issues in integrative ways. So I want to thank CB and also Leslie for the partnership. Thank all our panelists again for being here, and thank all of you. And then with that, I'll turn it over for our final question. But I know, again, some of you will have to leave, so thanks for waiting.
No worries. So my name's Prem Rajgopal. I'm a sustainable engineering master's student. And my question kind of wanted to unpack a little bit of that we talked about with universities in terms of how they've kind of, there's been this shift in terms of the corporatization of universities. So I was wondering if our panelists could unpack what is the purpose of an educational institution, and furthermore, when educational institutions do things like a hypothetical educational institution did things like take Koch money, spend millions in union busting, and invested its endowment in problematic institutions like the fossil fuel industry, would that be conflicting with your purpose?
I think the moderator should answer that.
I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, go for it, Michael. You first.
Yeah, we got to do better. The university has to do better. What can I tell you? I think that's something that's really
But you are not
controversial.
absolved of that revolution either, or whatever it is that needs to be done to bring issues to the administration's attention. We are all trying from our individual places on our respective perches. So it goes back to the difficulty of a system that's kind of entrenched and well lodged. And to kind of dislodge something and to shake it and move it, we need more ruckus, basically. Or I don't know what the right word is. Ruckus is a good word. Yeah, we need more. That's why I enjoyed the sit-ins in the Cathedral of Learning when I say, okay, they're doing something.
And I would also interject, and it relates to the woman's question who said, are you just waiting for the revolution? And tells people to wake up and listen. I was doing work on sustainability with companies and NGOs in the mid-1990s before becoming a professor at 40 years old. And if you had told me 20 years ago that all university procurement would require transparent disclosure of licensed apparel at the time at which I was telling companies, hey, you know what? Consumers want to know where your supply chain is. Students sat in, demanded, had their revolution, and now the 2 to 3% of the global garment market that is licensed collegiate apparel is utterly transparently procured, especially in public universities. You can click on a button and the entire vendor list for the University of Connecticut's 2,500 companies with factory-level addresses appears. 20 years ago, people told me, that will never happen, Shareen. That's proprietary information. Those are my trade secrets. Those relationships are about my business, not yours. Students said, no, that's not acceptable. We refuse to wear gear with our collegiate logo where we're paying tuition to big institutions which are fraught and complex, because this is one area you can change. It has changed, and that pushes the 97% of the rest of the apparel market in a direction it wouldn't have if we hadn't harnessed this potential that we have for using students in that 4 to 6 to 10 year moment when they are a captive audience and they are collectively able to be mobilized. And the revolution can come very quickly, whether it's the Cathedral of Learning or the President's Office or anywhere else, and where those students graduate, go out and multiply the effect of that awareness. At this point, I think that is precisely why a panel like this is really necessary. Does it include everybody it could have? No, but that's why the next panel will have an even more robust group of people. Maybe everybody will split up in small groups and have discussions and then vet back to the panel. We haven't invented enough forums yet to use the kind of input that we're getting today, because all of our universities are more dialogically oriented. You guys have a lot to say. You now have a forum known as your phone where you can do it. And so universities are catching up with how to harness this extraordinary energy and the engagement with communities that have historically not been at the table, right? I went to Columbia University. Columbia University was not the world's best landlord in 1968. Columbia University is a very different institution today because neighbors, allies, and other folks sat in until the university took recognition of its place in that neighborhood. Universities can and will change. It's slow, they're big, they're multi-billion-dollar, they're tied to investments and endowments and all sorts of things which are legally binding contracts. But part of what I think is really exciting when I look at supply chains and collegiate apparel is how much change came so quickly in a sector that people told me would never change. So here's to you for asking the questions. Here's to the other people who've expressed some frustration and how slow human rights change can be. Watch out, because you guys can change the world, and I think you are.
I just want to say, like I said before, every organization is on a journey, right? You're in sustainable engineering, and so you have the opportunity of seeing the system both technologically and behaviorally, but people are a huge part of that process. Like, we are talking about a 233-year-old institution that makes decisions that are sometimes based in documents that were written in the 1780s. So this is complicated, and when you're trying to make change, especially in the realm of sustainability, you have to give people time to process. You have to give people time to consider. You have to take all your engineering education and your systems thinking and put all that information in front of them, because you don't necessarily know what is going to motivate them to make the change that you need them to make, and you have to do that over time. Now, there's a time limit on how much we have, right? Like, to make this change, right? So there is an expeditious consideration here, but you want to make sure that you have the most robust conversation that you can have so you get the outcome that you want. And we're having that at all levels within the institution.
Yeah, I would just say if you're looking for an industry or a topic that is about instant gratification, this isn't it. That really, it requires the ability to have evolutionary thinking, to identify, recognize where the problem, but really to look at the aspect as continuous improvement, so that you're going to continue to make advancements. And I think, one of the things that like the university and the city have in common as institutions is that we have the responsibilities as a corporation, as a physical entity, but also have an impact on our surroundings and our environment, right? And Aurora and I work real closely on, the institutional master plan for the university, which I would say is probably one of the biggest and best physical manifestations of how the university is going to grow over time. And that's a statement of its values in terms of how it's going to invest. Just like the city's climate plan and comprehensive plan are a statement of our values, and how we embed those SDGs into that process are critical. We're not going to see that manifest itself tomorrow, but over the next generation, those changes are going to start to become more and more apparent. Same thing for institutional structures, for boards and commissions, for committees, for student-run organizations. These are all things that we can, in our capacity, can make contributions to make it better.
I bookmarked earlier the distinction between the aggregation of individual actions and collective social action, and maybe that's a good note to end on. We said in discussing the previous question that things like the SDGs are tools, and how they get used is largely going to be a function of how they get taken up and by whom. So, if your hypothetical university were also a university that were embracing the SDGs, then a useful tactic might be to point out some of the tensions and contradictions inherent in some of the positions that you're outlining, right? Like, that's how social movements work. They point out the gaps between ideals and reality, and they push really hard. And then they typically have less than complete success. And then they regroup and try again. But meanwhile, a new framework has come along, and so they shift discourses and shift vocabularies and push again, right? And that's okay. That's how it works. That's what we know historically works. And the SDGs are not a magic bullet any more than human rights were a magic bullet, any more than the rights of man were a magic bullet, any more than any other of these historical succession of things, right? It's all a question of the uses that people make, and those histories are still contested, right? And even that contestation over the histories is part of the struggle over how successful those things have been and what they're going to look like in the future. So, yeah, these are big, long, burning questions. Thanks again to everyone, to the panelists, to the CSB, for all of you for your fantastic questions.